Imagine how good it feels. You've made it. You're at the top of Metacritic. The money is pouring in as people love your game. You're on the top of the gaming world, and that thing you've been working on for ages is doing well. Then comes the discussion. What are we doing next? Well, you can do two things. You can either build on what you already had and make something even better, or you can go the other way entirely and drop the ball completely with your next game. I'm Jess from WhatCulture, and here are 10 disastrous follow-ups to great video games. Number 10. CRYTEK, Crysis 3 to Rise Son of Rome. Remember Rise Son of Rome? It's okay if you don't. It was one of those titles that was wheeled out pretty regularly by Microsoft to originally promote their Kinect peripheral for the Xbox 360, with lots of bombastic trailers shown filled with motion-controlled antics. As time went on though, it became clear that the game was far too ambitious for its own good, and the initial hype around Kinect died off as people realized you needed to live in a mansion to be able to play it effectively. This led to developers CRYTEK completely retooling the game to become a launch title for the Xbox One instead, and it was completely rebuilt to omit motion controls entirely and become a generic hack-and-slash title. As you'd expect from CRYTEK, the visuals were top-notch, but the story and actual gameplay left a lot to be desired. Rise was CRYTEK's next game after Crysis 3, which continued the great gameplay and visuals they'd established across the entire CRYTEK series. All told, Rise Son of Rome took at least 3 years to develop, with significant changes throughout its development cycle, and it completely failed to set the world on fire upon launch. Nowadays, it's just remembered as a generic title that faded into the ether, despite plans for CRYTEK to develop the IP into a new franchise. UBISOFT Montreal, Assassin's Creed Black Flag to Watch Dogs. There's been a lot of Assassin's Creed games over the years, but we're more than happy to have a swashbuckling pirate duel with anyone who disagrees with Assassin's Creed Black Flag being one of, if not the best game in the series. With extra refinement to the early Assassin's Creed formula, a pirate ship of your own to sail wherever you want, and some lovely sea shanties to entertain you, Black Flag was an absolute delight from start to finish. The game was well received by both fans and critics alike, and still to this day is fondly remembered as a high point in the long sprawling series. Unfortunately for developers Ubisoft Montreal, their next game was nowhere near up to scratch. Watch Dogs may have looked like an extremely promising new IP, but honestly, it was a little bit rubbish. The hacking mechanics were cool for a bit, but the bland protagonist, stiff uninspired storyline, and equally dire open world just made the whole thing a little bit meh. Massive graphical downgrades from what was originally shown in trailers were also present, and although it did well on sales, Ubisoft completely rebooted the series with a more fun and wacky spin when the sequel came around. Number 8. Kojima Productions, PT to Metal Gear Solid 5 The Phantom Pain. On paper, Metal Gear Solid 5 The Phantom Pain doesn't sound like a disaster. In fact, it's got a ton of fans. Released to critical and commercial success, you'd be right in questioning why it's on this list at all. It's a decent game, sure, but there's so much more to it that makes it a disaster. The main problem with Metal Gear Solid 5 is that at some point during its development, publisher Konami and developer Hideo Kojima came to blows. A massive disagreement turned into a massive rift, and at some point, Kojima took himself and his team away from Metal Gear Solid 5, and the game remains completely unfinished. It's such a shame because until you get towards the end, it's an exceptional achievement, but you just can't look past the point that instead of a full final act, you simply have to repeat a few missions, then repeat the opening mission again to unlock an ending cinematic. It's a highly disappointing end to not only the game, but the entire Metal Gear series as a whole. It's such a shame, particularly as Kojima and co were riding high with the success of their PT demo just a year before, which in turn was a tease for a Kojima-fronted Silent Hills game, which we didn't get to see. Number 7. Visceral Games, Dead Space 2 to Dead Space 3. When you've got such a hugely successful new survival horror IP as Dead Space, you'd probably expect you need to keep the momentum going and give people more of what worked. But no! Publishers EA thought Dead Space was just too survival horror-y for gamers, and tasked developers Visceral Games with creating a more accessible follow-up for Dead Space 3. Gone is the tension and atmosphere of the previous games, replaced with more action-heavy sections, cooperative gameplay, and Dead Space 3 3 is absolutely riddled with microtransactions from head to toe. People didn't take too kindly to it at all. It was Dead Space in name only. Whatever was produced here just wasn't in keeping with the rest of the series and its terrifying antics so far. The reception to the third game meant Dead Space was completely shelved as an IP until just earlier in 2021 when the first game was announced as getting a reboot. Developers Visceral Games were also completely shut down by EA in the wake of the game's poor reception, despite the fact that they probably didn't want to make the game that way in the first place and were forced to by their publishers. The games industry is a lovely place sometimes, isn't it? Number 6. BioWare, Dragon Age Inquisition to Mass Effect Andromeda. After a bit of a rocky reception to Dragon Age 2 and later Mass Effect 3, BioWare had a lot to prove with Dragon Age Inquisition. Thankfully, they totally delivered. Dragon Age Inquisition is a return to form for BioWare, and the game is absolutely worth anyone's time. It's a world that's easy to get lost in for 50 or 100 hours in my case, filled with stuff to see, stuff to do, great combat, and BioWare's trademark in-depth character-driven storytelling. If you're looking for old-school BioWare fun, there was definitely a strong glimmer of it in DA Inquisition. Unfortunately, BioWare's next game was not so good. Even worse, it was the new Mass Effect. Designed to kick off a new trilogy, Mass Effect Andromeda was absolutely mauled by the internet the moment it released. Well known for its hilarious bugs such as the infamous dead-eyed stare of characters, the game was unpolished, unsatisfying, and was unworthy of bearing the Mass Effect name. Patches since release have made the game much better than it was before, but the damage was done, and poor sales meant Andromeda can now constantly be found in bargain bins everywhere. We do hope that BioWare's learned its lesson and their next foray into the Mass Effect universe will be much better. Number 5. Core Design, Tomb Raider 2 to Ninja Shadow of Darkness. Back in the 90s, Core Design really started making a name for itself, mainly because of the massive success of the Tomb Raider franchise and the mass media appeal of its new protagonist, Lara Croft. The original Tomb Raider was extremely well received, and a sequel was of course inevitable. Tomb Raider 2 gave us more of the same as the original, but with more varied levels, some new moves for Miss Croft, and it enjoyed both critical and commercial success upon its release in 1997. As is the case with many developers of the 90s, the team at Core Design also had several games in the pipeline too. The very next game they released after Tomb Raider 2 was received nowhere near as warmly. Ninja Shadow of Darkness was described by one reviewer for Game Informer as having, quote, a pitiful excuse for a fighting engine and a story that could be added up to one word: sucks. Put Ninja to pasture and play Tenchu instead. Game Informer gave it a paltry 2.5 out of 10, and many other outlets weren't kind to it either. Number 4. Ninja Theory, Enslaved Odyssey to the West to DMC Devil May Cry. Chances are you probably never played Enslaved Odyssey to the West, but let us tell you, it's one of the most underrated games available on the 360 and PS3. Developed by Ninja Theory in partnership with renowned film mocap actor Andy Serkis, most famous for playing Gollum in Lord of the Rings, Enslaved was a beautiful-looking third-person post-apocalyptic adventure, centered around a growing bond between two characters. It didn't set the world on fire with its sales, in fact it's considered a commercial failure, but the actual game underneath is quite fantastic. In comparison, Ninja Theory's next game, DMC Devil May Cry, sold reasonably well, but everybody pretty much hated it. DMC was a weird game. It was the reboot of the Devil May Cry series and featured a new, more edgy and millennial Dante that basically everybody pushed back against as soon as he was revealed. It was meant to be a bold new direction from the series, and for some fans it was, but the backlash against the character and the overall presentation meant that Capcom soon reevaluated what they were doing, and the overall sales of the game were much less than that of the game before, Devil May Cry 4. Number 3. Monolith Productions, Middle-earth Shadow of Mordor to Middle-earth Shadow of War. Talk about having an absolute gem of a game on your hands. and then dropping it down the toilet on the sequel. Middle-earth's Shadow of Mordor was a fantastic new foray into the Lord of the Rings universe for Monolith Productions, delivering a game that was all the best parts of Batman Arkham and Assassin's Creed rolled into lovely Lord of the Rings aesthetics. It was great stuff, and it was only further enhanced by the implementation of the Nemesis system, which still amazes us to this day that more games haven't copied it. Given its critical and commercial success, a sequel was definitely on the cards. We thought that what we'd be getting was a more refined, even better version of what came before. Instead, what we got was another blooming game so packed full of microtransactions that it completely ruined everything else around it. No matter what you did in Shadow of War, it seemed to constantly be trying to entice you to spend your money to get better stuff than what you could actually get in the game as standard. Publisher Warner Bros. Has since realized the error of their ways and patched all of the offending microtransactions out of the game entirely, but the damage has already been done and the franchise seems to be all but dead. Number 2. Team Ninja. Ninja Gaiden 2 to Metroid Other M. Nintendo is usually very protective of their most iconic IPs, so when Metroid Other M, fronted by external developers Team Ninja, was announced, it came as something of a surprise. Turns out Nintendo probably should have stuck to their guns and kept Metroid in-house, as Other M really isn't good at all. The problem with Other M was its narrative just wasn't up to scratch for what we'd expect from Metroid. Samus's characterization was terrible, and the plot just dragged along from point to point with little to actually enjoy. It also implements a really weird first-person view for Samus at various points, and it just doesn't work very well. Team Ninja were probably chosen for the project because they had a good reputation developing quality action games. They are particularly well known for the Ninja Gaiden franchise, and they just come off the back of developing the commercially successful Ninja Gaiden 2 before they released Metroid Other M. Unsurprisingly, Other M didn't set the world on fire, and the series has again been reinvigorated with Metroid Dread, and presumably the upcoming Metroid Prime 4. Number 1. CYBERPUNK Red, or CD Projekt Red if you prefer. The Witcher 3 to Cyberpunk 2077. Oh boy, you know all about this one. After the launch of The Witcher 3, developers CYBERPUNK Red had the world at their feet. Their game was one of the most critically acclaimed titles in history, and had sold by the bucket loads. On top of that, CYBERPUNK Red presented a nice guy image and was considered to be one of the best gaming developers in the world. As such, interest in the developer's next game, Cyberpunk 2077, was understandably at an all-time high. When it was first shown off, looking incredible and extremely ambitious, everyone thought CYBERPUNK Red were gonna do it again. Then came the launch of Cyberpunk, absolutely riddled with game-breaking bugs and barely able to run depending on what platform you bought it for. Cyberpunk was responsible for eradicating CYBERPUNK's reputation almost instantly overnight. The game clearly wasn't ready for full release and was pushed out after multiple delays, but it really could have done with being delayed even further. Imagine if we got Cyberpunk in 2022 instead, fully finished and optimized for the PS5 and Series X. You can't help but imagine that the stories around its release would have been very different. And that is the end of our list. Do let me know down in that comment box if you can think of any other disastrous follow-ups to great video games. As always, I've been Jess from WhatCulture. Thank you so much for hanging out with me. If you like, you can come say hi to me on my Twitter account where I'm @JessMcDonald, but make sure you stay tuned to us here for plenty more great content.